Hi, everybody. This is your friend Anthony Burrows for Life and Finances with Sacrifice and Service. Now, this past week I had reason for reflection, and I was looking at our nation in terms of from whence we have come and then how much further we have to go. That caused me to ponder a question within myself, and that question was, which generation before us was most impactful on where we are living today and how we are existing today? Now, of course, it brought the thought as to when you use the word generation, you're saying, hey, what's a generation? People have all kind of thoughts on that. But a generation really and truly is any group of people who were born at a certain time in a certain time period, and they all lived during that time period. And then you'd say, hey, how long is a generation? Now, usually a generation of persons are when they are born, then to the point when they begin having children to produce the second generation. And that span is usually 20 to 30 years. And having gone through this thought, generations and all of that, I gave my father a call. He's 81 years old. I think he was born in 1939. That's a very long time ago. And so I said to him, Daddy, tell me something. Looking at it, would you say that your children generation, us in particular, your children, have done better than you and your generation, in particular, your siblings? And without a doubt, quickly he said, hey, yes, you all have. So I said, well, what are you basing that on? He said, well, you look at it, all of you got an education. Each of you have a reliable job or income, consistent income, and each of you own a reasonable home. So we talked some more, but that wasn't satisfactory to me. So I thought of my mother, but of course she's deceased, so I gave her last surviving sibling, an aunt of mine, a call. And I asked her, what did she think in terms of have our generation done better than her generation? And immediately she went to majority rule that when it came in, she had just finished high school, which was 14 or 15, and that's when she was able to get a scholarship. Her and about 40 other persons, and they set up a special 2 classes in St. Anne's. And that class and that particular group of classmates produced doctors, lawyers, politicians, teachers, and all who have made some significant impact on this nation. If we call the names of the persons in those classes, you'll know them. And it took me back to the time when we used to gather around the table as a family, in particular on Saturdays and Sundays, having dinner. Mother and father at the head and leg of the table, if you'd call it that. The girls on one side, the boys on one side, and we'd have ferocious arguments at the table, be it politics, you name it. Of course, we were children at the time, and the only time we could speak freely like that was at the dinner table. Now, my mother had a saying was, hey, me and your daddy, we going. You all coming. Y'all is the next generation, so start preparing for it. And so we're looking at the most impactful Bahamian generation. Now, let's look at some of the things, number one, that the previous generation experienced that we may not have been so much aware about. You have in 1834, that's the Emancipation Act. So you have children, teen, young adults, and elderly persons, they witnessed this exact thing. You can imagine they went to bed one night as slaves, woke up the next day free. Of course, the Pompey had his rebellion in Exuma 5 years prior to that. Then we have the 1920s with men like Dr. Robert Love, who pursued the notion of the all men are equal, equality of man, and then self-governance within the British Empire. We come to the 1940s, which was a tumultuous time. You had the Burma Road riot. You had the Inagua riot. And then in the Burma Road riot, there were 100 persons arrested, 40 injured. There was looting. Then you had 5 killed. Now, the man killed. You had Harold McIntosh. David Smith, Ray and Donald Johnson, they were brothers. James Alexander made the fifth person, and you saw the birth of the labor union. Now, you look at it and say, what sets a generation apart so that they can be counted as the most impactful? And these are the things, three items that I looked at. First one is self-determination. And we see where they wanted self-governance. Then you have sacrifice, self-sacrifice. And these men lost their lives trying to build a foundation and prepare a road for us, even though they may not have think of it like that at the time. And then the third item is the pursuance of an ideal greater than themselves. And the ideal they pursue at the time were three primary things. First and foremost, they wanted a livable wage. Not minimum wage. A minimum wage came in 1993. Then they wanted access to education. That's what their children in particular. And they wanted self-governance, which is political power. We've gotten political power, but Lord, we're still economic slaves. We don't own lands. We don't have home ownership. We got the consumer mindset, and we don't own businesses. Well, I always talk about those, so no reason for me to elaborate. The thing is, the 40s paved the way for majority rule and life as we live today. Now, number two, for the most impactful generation, let's look at the trades in which they were engaged. We had wrecking. And wrecking really and truly, in my opinion, was dishonest and should have been deemed as illegal. But I guess it's a reflection of the times in which they live. Originally, persons didn't know the waters coming in, would run into some of the shoals and the reefs. The citizens would then go out and claim the cargo, rescue the crew, and the thing is then take the cargo and ship it back to Europe, and in case ship it to Europe and ship it to the southern United States. And the thing is, government collected revenue, customs duties on this. We had sisal, which is putting together when you come up with the rope and all of that. But of course, the Philippines came up with a more productive way and faster way and came up with better ropes and all of that. Then we had sponging, bootlegging, which bootlegging was mainly in the late 20s and 30s when the U.S. was considered prohibition, which meant no liquor. So liquor was ran through the Bahamas to the United States. And tourism came along, which was a real big savior for us. And tourism is probably the vast and the largest way of getting foreign reserve for any country, because around the world, you have hundreds of millions of tourists that's moving. Our goal, hopefully one day, will be to have 20 million tourists coming to the Bahamas annually. And we could do that, but we have to own the product. And of course, you had the drug trafficking era, when we saw many men, women, boys, and girls lost their lives. But that's the way it was. Now, let's look at some data in terms of population. In 1845, the population of the Bahamas was 26,491. In 1901, it was 53,735. 1943 was 68,846. 1960, 109,532. 2010, 351,461. 2019, 393,248. Now, from the 1800s to the 1950s, population was evenly dispersed throughout our archipelago. But the boom of the 60s in Freeport and Nassau saw persons making their way to these two particular islands. Now, Nassau population currently is in excess of 230,000. Freeport is said to be around 65,000, but with Dorian and the pandemic, I don't know if it's still at that. Let's look at some things now. The land area for the Bahamas, if you take all the land and glue them together, 3,865 square miles. Now, our countrywide population density, that's the number of persons in a square mile, for the entire nation is 102 persons per square mile. Now, for Nassau, the density per square mile is we have 2,849 persons per square mile. That's congestion. That's why we have the traffic Everybody dashing for the couple apartments, everybody dashing for the few jobs. When you have congestion, it leads to that crime, will elevate poverty, all the different things. Now, I say let's compare to some of our neighbors. Kingston, their density per square mile is 3,600 persons per square mile. I can believe that, probably more from the time when I was in Kingston. And the Port of Spain, Trinidad, 9,806 persons per square mile. Let's look at it. Miami, where Bahamians like to go and drop our money, 13,512 persons per square mile. I wouldn't talk about Tokyo, New York, Mexico City, New Delhi, places like that. Now, the thing is, the previous generations, 90% of Bahamians at the time owned the land on which they live and the home in which they live. Now, the homes really and truly was simple, just 3-room homes and then an outhouse in the back. And they saw themselves as poor, but they simply lacked opportunities, but they had these things. Then the persons in those times who had consistent income, they saved and prepared for the future. And so that's how many of them purchased lands. Now, most islands had full employment, and I guess that's because many persons were farmers and fishermen, and some worked for the different areas that was around and farms that was around in the country at the time. Then in the southern Bahamas, there was concentrated with Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, and parts of Central and South America. And local businesses flourished, which were mainly petty shops, but they were local businesses. Now, let's look at the generation that really had the impact. And it's 2 generations that really equal each other in terms of the impact so that we could be free as we are today. The persons born in the 20s, they made the ultimate sacrifice because in the 40s, that's where they lost their lives at the Burma Road riots and the 2 who lost their lives at the Inagua riot. Then the persons born in the 30s and 40s, they were the ones who brought in the majority rule. So I put these 2 generations as the most impactful generation. Now, I saw something that was so interesting this week when I look at 2 generations and at the separate end of the spectrum, but having the same point of view. I look at the Speaker of the House this week, and then we look at Travis Robinson, MP. Moultrie, as the Speaker, is 67 years old. Robinson is 24. Both of them question, hey, what's wrong with democracy in the Bahamas and that there's no real democracy? And so you have 2 persons on 2 different generations coming to the same point of view. Now, Moultrie's concern was that, hey, the House of Assembly is the bedrock of democracy, and that cabinet ministers really and truly are responsible to the House of Assembly as opposed to the executive branch. Then Robinson's issue was that, hey, he did not get to speak on the bill that was on the floor before they brought it to vote. Now, in his case, he could have stood up and say, hey, gentlemen, I haven't spoken. I want to say my 2 cents. And Moultrie probably could have gotten with the executive branch, make his complaint, and lobby him to start bringing about the changes. But we'll see what happens. Now, when we look at the generations that's to come, we have to prepare the way. And here's how we have to look at it. We have to now, the changes that we need to make is change this educational system. We have to pursue business ownership. And the single most important thing that we have to be rid of, we have to find a way to dump the self-hate and deepen democracy in our country. Now, for me, since we only participate every 5 years, to mark X, let's reduce it to every 2 or 3 years, have election every 2 or 3 years so we can have more participation. So, I am Anthony Barrows for Life and Finances with Sacrifice and Service, saying, may the God of heaven and his Son, the Christ, bless and prosper you. See you